Hello. If you're tuning into this talk, chances are that you, like me, follow the climate change discussions closely and are worried about our collective future. The headlines couldn't be clearer. The latest IPCC climate report, which was published over the summer, declared a code red emergency for humanity. It says in no uncertain terms that if immediate action is not undertaken to drastically reduce carbon emissions, we will shoot past 1.5 degree warming, the level considered safe by scientists. Global average temperatures are already up by 1 degree since the 1920s. In fact, we're on track for 3.5 degree warming. All those decades of burning fossil fuels and reliance on plastics and petroleum and unchecked deforestation to meet our endless demand for agricultural commodities like palm oil for Nutella. Yes, Nutella, our childhood favorite, seems to be catching up with us. If average temperatures rise to 3 or 3.5 degrees, unmitigated disasters will unfold across the globe. It's not just that polar caps will melt and coastal towns will flood, extreme weather events will be widespread and become commonplace. Supply chains will be disrupted. This will impact what we eat, how we travel, and where we live. Nowhere will be safe. If we shoot past the 1.5 or 2 degree warming scenarios, we would have created a hell on Earth. The IPCC report urges immediate and deep cuts in emissions to put us on a path to 1.5 degree warming. And countries and companies are making commitments to become net zero by 2050, essentially reaching the point of not emitting any carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on a net basis. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are making commitments to cut emissions in their nationally determined commitments, or NDCs. Countries are committing to phasing out coal and fossil fuels and using more renewables in the energy mix. The alternatives to dirty fuels are expensive. The question often gets asked, who will pay for these cuts in emissions? And this is where the conversation becomes challenging. In the lead up to COP26, India, the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, formally repudiated setting a net zero date, questioning the virtue of setting a 2050 target, and pointing out that historically, India has contributed only 4% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions since the 1950s. India's burgeoning middle class continues to grow rapidly. Unfortunately, aspirations and emissions go hand in hand. It seems unfair to ask the Indians and the Chinese and communities all over the developing world to defer their hopes and dreams when an average American emits about 8 times the carbon than an average Indian. Concerns of equity and climate justice are perfectly valid. The only problem is, accepting those concerns as grounds for inaction doesn't move the needle on climate change. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can find a way to pay for more expensive and less polluting solutions by leveraging the power of the carbon markets. The idea behind carbon markets is simple. Countries and corporates that have a higher marginal cost of abating carbon emissions can pay countries and communities that have lower marginal abatement costs. Because we share the same atmosphere, all carbon emissions are created equal, but the cost of reducing carbon emissions is different. So, for example, for a cement and steel manufacturer in China, replacing blast furnaces with an electric furnace might be cost prohibitive and only reduce, let's say, 50 tons of carbon emissions. But for the city of Beijing, switching city buses from gas to electric might not be as expensive and reduce 500 tons of carbon emissions. However, the city of Beijing may not have the funds to pay for electric buses. In this hypothetical, the steel manufacturer can transact carbon credits with the city of Beijing and help defray the cost for the city and buy itself time for technologies to develop that would bring down the cost of electric furnaces. The net impact on the environment is fewer carbon emissions. The concept of trading carbon via credits in the markets is still in its infancy, and we need more such transactions. Carbon market participants can reduce global emissions more efficiently. Another example of this would be the LEAF Coalition. And there are several other initiatives, but the LEAF Coalition is a $1 billion initiative to end tropical deforestation. The money comes from donor governments such as those of Norway and the UK, as well as from corporations like Amazon, Unilever, and Nestle. The idea is relatively straightforward. Pay states and countries around the world to reduce tropical deforestation. Reductions are represented in 1 metric ton of carbon, with each ton representing a single carbon credit. Coalition participants pay $10 per credit. Payments are made only after actual emission reductions have been achieved by reducing levels of deforestation and forest degradation, or by restoring forests. The carbon credits are independently verified by third-party verifiers, thereby ensuring environmental integrity. Payments help forest countries set a course for sustainable economic development that conserves and restores forests while supporting local communities and livelihoods. Each nation or community can decide how to best make use of their money and figure out the best ways to help its people. Essentially, by putting the $10 price on carbon, we have the power of changing the economics of the forest. There is now a premium on keeping a forest alive rather than cutting it down. And countries around the world can get paid to protect standing forests. The economic trade-offs for policymakers deciding between cattle ranching in Brazil, or palm oil production in Indonesia, or cocoa production in Ghana look very different when the positive externality of reducing carbon emissions is priced into the equation. It's also a good use of aid money and corporate dollars. For the corporates, this is about supplementary action, not a substitution for cuts in emissions that are required of them. Corporates can compensate for emissions on their path to net zero in compliance with the latest net zero guidance by the Science Based Targets initiative. But this approach to conservation and forest protection at massive scale doesn't have to stop at just forests. What if we extended this idea to all forms of emissions? Agriculture and food production, transportation, and renewable energy. What if we incentivized state and non-state actors to cut emissions by doling out payments in exchange for robustly measured and independently verified emission reductions, and got rich countries and rich corporations around the world to pay for those emission reductions? Think of the payments as reparations for climate injustice, but instead of paying for sins of the past, the payments are forward-looking and paid against quantified and measurable progress in cutting emissions. Even at the $10 per ton price, which is much lower than what the price of carbon should be, the transfer of wealth from the global north to the global south would be enormous. Entrepreneurs in the developing world beaming with ideas around new battery technology, or satellite monitoring of existing forests, or using artificial intelligence to look for methane emissions from old coal mines will usher in a new gold rush. Carbon reductions, and not hydrocarbons, will be the new currency. Emerging economies are going to be a big source of carbon emissions in the coming decades. They're going to need all the help that they can get if we must collectively cut our emissions. If we can pay the developing countries to pollute less, help them achieve their NDCs, and sell the surplus credits to countries and companies that find it hard to abate emissions, then we would have found a solution that is fair, equitable, just, and practical. And it might just give us a fighting chance against climate change. Thank you.